Okay, super. Okay, so welcome to our introductory lesson on psychology. So first things first, we need to think about what is psychology. Some of you might have done psychology GCSE, some of you may have not. So when we think of psychology, we need to be thinking about how this is actually the scientific study of the human mind and its functions, and especially those affecting behaviour in a given context. So please note that here at the REN, we study psychology as a science A-level, okay? So we're looking at the science of mind and behaviour. So what we're going to cover this afternoon is we're going to look at common misconceptions that surround psychology. We're also going to go through exactly what your course entitles, so what's in your course, what exam board we're looking at, what assessments can you expect to be doing, and just in general what to expect whilst we're doing this subject. Then I'm also going to give you an insight into an aspect of the course, so we're going to have a little taster of psychology, and then we're going to look at how to prepare for the course and the summer work that you'll be expected to do. At any point, if you have any questions, please just write them in the chat. Hopefully it'll ping for me and I can answer. So first things first, let's deal with these misconceptions. Okay, so psychology is not, I'm afraid, an easy subject. It is not an easy subject at all, okay? It is also not just common sense, and it is not wishy-washy and unscientific. And equally, it is not all about feelings, okay? So if that's what you were hoping for, you might need to reassess your choice. Something else to bear in mind is that psychologists are not all the same, okay? So they're not necessarily all going to agree about how to explain a certain behavior. They're also not spending all their time analysing people, okay? This is not what they do every single minute of every day. They are also not able to read people's mind. So if you have that fear, please put it to bed. And they're also not only interested in people who are abnormal, okay? Psychologists take an interest in a wide variety of different people. So hopefully that's clarified what psychology is not, and it's also clarified what psychologists are not. So let's now move on to what psychology is. So if we look at the etymology of the word, it's actually broken down into two words that come from the Greek. So we've got psyche, which is basically looking at the human soul, the mind or the spirit, and we've got ology. Ology means the study of. So for example, in biology, you've got bio, which is life, and you've got ology, which is the study. So biology is the study of life. Well, in psychology, we're going to be looking at the study of the mind. So psychology is the study of people. It is looking at their behavior and also looking at their mind. As I've mentioned, it is scientific and it's not an easy subject. I say this because it's quite content heavy, okay? So a lot of psychology will be new. It is really interesting, but because it looks at such a broad array of things, it makes it quite demanding in terms of how much content you have to be exposed to and try to retain. Psychology is also always changing. So we'll see how theories throughout time have changed and evolved. However, it is absolutely fascinating and you'll probably find it really worthwhile. So what psychology do we do here at the REN? Well, we follow the AQA A-level psychology course, and I put the number there for you to refer to. I've also got a link to the spec. I guess you can't click on it to make that work for you, but maybe if you take a screenshot, or to be honest, if you Google AQA psychology specification, it should come up. Just be careful that we are doing the A-level, okay? We're not doing the AS. So make sure whenever you're looking at the spec, you're looking at the bit that corresponds to the A-level, not the AS. This is known as a linear course. So this means that we learn throughout time and all your assessments are at the end of the 2-year course. This does not mean that we don't do assessments throughout our time in class, but ultimately your psychology A-level will depend on the 3 exams you sit at the end of the 2-year course. There are 3 papers and all 3 papers are worth the same. Okay, so they're all as important as each other. So we are preparing to sit at the end of the 2-year course 3 exam papers, which are 2 hours in length each. There is no coursework at all, okay? It is all exam-based. So hopefully you pick this because you know their exams are your thing, or because it links in well with another subject that does have some coursework, because that can provide a nice balance. In your paper 1, so remember all 3 papers are sat at the end of the 2-year course, but they obviously have paper 1, paper 2 and paper 3. So in your first paper, we look at social influence, which is basically looking at conformity. So why do people conform? We also look at obedience. Again, why do people obey? We also look at trying to explain social influence and why some people are able to resist that. We look at minority influence, and we also look at the role of social influence in social change. Then we look at memory. So here we look at two different types of models to try and explain how your memory works. We look at the different types of long-term memory. We also try to explain forgetting. Then we look at the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, and we look at how we can improve it. Then we look at attachment. This topic concerns mostly the bond between a caregiver and an infant. So we try to explain attachment. We look at different ways to measure attachment. And we also look at what happens when an attachment isn't created. Then finally, for your paper 1, we look at psychopathology. So here we look at different ways that we can define abnormality. We also look at the characteristics of 3 disorders. So we look at phobias, we look at depression, and we look at OCD. And then we have 3 different approaches to explain and treat those disorders. So we do a behavioral approach, a cognitive approach, and a biological approach. Okay, so that paper has those 4 topics in it. As you can see, it's quite content heavy. It's 96 marks in total, so it's basically a third of your A level. And in that, you can expect some sort of multiple choice, but not a lot. There's also some short answers, so 2 markers, 4 markers, and then there's some extended writing. So the longest amount of writing you'd have to do in psychology is a 16 marker, and that would count as your essay. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense for your paper 1. Then for paper 2, this time we look at different approaches in psychology. So earlier I hinted at that not all psychologists believe the same things. There are actually lots of different approaches within psychology. So we would look at the learning approach, the cognitive approach, the biological approach, the psychodynamic approach, and the humanistic approach. We would also look at comparing all those approaches with each other. Then there is the biopsychology topic. So this time it looks more closely at the relationship between biology and psychology. So things like looking at your nervous system, looking at your hormones, looking at how function is localized within your brain, looking at different ways of studying the brain, and also looking at biological rhythms. Okay, so this one is more obviously heavily with biology. And then finally in that paper, there is also a section that is purely research methods. Now, research methods is found throughout your 3 papers, but it is also explicitly within that research methods section in your paper 2. So this is looking at like the experimental method, different ways that we can carry out research, the scientific process. It looks at data handling and analysis, and it also looks at inferential testing. Okay, so this is the bit that allows psychology to be really scientific. It is possibly the driest bit of the course, but we tend to do it throughout the year, so you don't just have a massive stretch of research methods. Okay, so that's your paper 2 in a nutshell. Once again, you can expect some multiple choice, some short answers, and possibly some extended writing. So that could be your 16 marker, or in research methods, you can have some extended writing, which would be, you might be asked to design a study. Okay, then your paper 3 is a little bit different. Okay, so in paper 3, you have a section which is called issues and debates. So this is when we literally look at the big issues and debates within psychology. So we would look at, for example, gender and culture in psychology. We look at whether we have free will or whether determinism is correct. We look at the nature-nurture debates, and we look at holism and reductionism, as well as ideographic and nomothetic approaches and ethical implications. Okay, so the big issues and debates in psychology. Then you can see the next 3 lines. I've added, hopefully, helpfully, a little star. So this suggests we would only do 1 out of these. Okay, so depending on the class, we can sort of pick together whether we want to study either gender relationships or cognition and development, or, so we pick one of those, and then we can pick one from schizophrenia, eating disorders, and stress. And then we can pick one from aggression, forensic psychology, and addiction. So obviously, depending on the year, sometimes students have different interests, and we would decide together which option to pick as a group. So that is as fair as can be. This paper is also worth a third of your A level. It is also out of 96 marks. And then when you go through that paper, you'd obviously have to be careful to pick the section you've actually studied and not answer incorrect sections. Okay, so that is the bulk of what to expect in your papers. Okay, so there is a paper 1, a paper 2, and a paper 3. All 3 of them are worth 2 hours, and you would prepare to sit them in the summer 2023. Remember that research method is found throughout all the papers, but it does have its own special section in your paper 2. Okay, so just a quick recap. Paper 1 is social, memory, attachment, and psychopathology. Paper 2 is approaches, biopsychology, and research methods. And then paper 3 has issues and debates. And then here's, for example, a selection of choice we could pick would be gender, schizophrenia, and aggression. But like I said, we would decide as a class what to do. Okay, so how are you actually assessing your exams? Well, there are different AOs in psychology that you are assessed on. Okay, so we've got AO1, AO2, and AO3. You may have come across these before, but they are very prescriptive as to what they entail in psychology. So anything that is an AO1 is a question that would ask you to describe something. So the purpose of those assessments is to check your knowledge and understanding. Whenever an assessment objective is looking at an AO2, this time it's looking for you to apply your knowledge. So you're literally applying your knowledge and understanding to a novel scenario. And then when we do AO3, this time you need to explain. So here you would be looking to show your analysis, your interpretation, but most importantly, your evaluation. Okay, so on top of developing these skills ready for your exam, you'll also need to become confident in creating your own studies, hence the research method, and applying that psychology knowledge to everyday life. Okay, so this is how you are assessed in psychology, in your abilities to describe your knowledge, to apply your knowledge, and to evaluate your knowledge. So have a little look now. I won't put you on the spot, but just look at those words. I'm just going to give you a few minutes or a few seconds to think about which of these words go under which AO. All right, I'll just give you a few minutes. Okay, so hopefully you've had a bit of time to look at each one and think about what bracket they would fall under. So I'll now show you where they should be. I haven't forgotten how to use it. Here we go. So all your AO1s were things like describe, outline, identify, name, state, define, explain. Although explain's a tricky one because sometimes it can mean AO2. So you'd have to look at the question, see whether it just says explain what is meant by, or whether it's saying explain how this person would, and then you're applying your knowledge. Okay, so AO2 is apply, justify, suggest, and like I just said, explain. Whereas your AO3, be careful if you see the word discuss in a question, that usually means outline and evaluate. Okay, so it has some AO3 content, but it also has some AO1. Whereas analyze and evaluate is purely AO3. Okay, so these are the sort of words that you can expect to see in your questions, as I'm about to show you. And you just need to be able to identify, therefore, what the question is asking you to do. Whether it's asking you to show off your knowledge, whether it's asking you to apply your knowledge, or to evaluate what you know. Okay, so here they are again, just to make it really clear. So AO1 is all about demonstrating knowledge, AO2 is about applying that knowledge, and AO3 is about being able to evaluate. The other thing that's interesting on this slide is to notice how the AOs vary according to the papers. So you can see how in your paper 1, there is a balance here between AO1, AO2, and AO3, which is different to your paper 2. So you can see in your paper 2, you are required to have a lot more application skills. And then again, your paper 3, there is a heavier focus on evaluation. Okay, so this is why we do spend a lot of our time developing the applying and evaluating, because it's not just about the knowledge. The other thing to note is that the research methods, as I've mentioned before, being in all 3 of your papers, is about 25 to 30% of the overall assessments. Okay, so it's really worthwhile investing our time in getting to know these. I'm going to show you some example questions just so you can see how the AOs apply. So here you can see some typical AO1 questions if you're simply asked to outline a characteristic of depression or explain what is meant by obedience. Those are all AO1 questions. And then here for an AO2, you can see that it would give you a STEM or a scenario, and then you have to apply your knowledge to that scenario. And then for AO3, you are asked to give a criticism, which would be an evaluation point, or to evaluate a theory. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And then for your essays, this is the extended writing, so you can have a mini essay if you like, which is an 8 marker, which would be 3 AO1 and 5 AO3, or you can have your 16 markers, which is 6 AO1 and 10 AO3. Okay, so now you've got an idea of the demand of the writing. You can also be given an application essay. These are actually kinder than they look. So this time you would still have your 6 AO1, but you would also have 4 AO2, so where you then need to apply that knowledge to the scenario given, and then you would just have 6 AO3, so you still have to do your evaluation at the end. Okay, so what to expect while studying psychology here at the Wren? Well, just like any subject, you will of course be expected to attend all lessons. And of course, if you miss a lesson, then it is up to you to catch up the work. You will have my email address, and we would also have a team on Teams where you can contact me and your friends to make sure that you can catch up on any work. You will be expected to work independently, but we also do some group work. So for example, when you get to conduct your own experiment, it's nice to work in groups. You sometimes have to conduct some self and peer marking, and also have some independent reflection time. You would also be expected to participate in class activities. So for example, we run debates, which can be really good fun. You would also sometimes be asked to do a presentation on a topic. And you would of course be expected to complete all your home learning on time and to the best of your ability. What will you need? Well, my best advice to you would be first things first, go off and print that spec so that you know exactly what we are going to be looking at, although I've gone through it pretty thoroughly today. Here is the textbook that I would advise you to purchase. It is the 2nd edition. It's not massively different to the 1st edition, but just so you're aware, it is the 2nd edition. And this will be the book that we use in year 1. I would then advise you to get some small ring binders, okay? So you can see that we've got a lot of content that we're going to have to go through. And I think the way that students find it easiest to organize themselves is to have a small ring binder per topic. So for example, all of memory would go in one ring binder and all of attachment would go in another ring binder. I think it's more useful to do it that way than to have a big folder per paper. You are also expected to have an A4 exercise book. This is where you will be doing your essay writing. It makes it really easy for me to give you feedback on your essays, and we can see that progression that you're making. You would also need a ruler and a calculator, which I'm sure you have anyway, but obviously sometimes students forget that there is a maths element in psychology, so you would need a calculator. Okay, so I've talked a lot actually about what to expect for psychology here. So before I move on to giving you a little taste of psychology, I will just give you a minute in case you have any questions that you would like to write in the chat. Please feel free. I'm honestly happy to answer anything. Okay, well, I guess the presentation was so clear that there are no questions. Okay, well, I will move on. And if throughout any of this you want to write something, then please feel free. Okay, so here we go. We're going to go for a taste of psychology. I have selected to cover some research methods because as you've seen, it's 30% of your course. So it's really worthwhile getting this right from the start. It's also something that I thought would be accessible to you because some of it links to what you've done already in science. Okay, so today we're going to look at, as you can see from your spec, we need to be able to state aims and to talk about the difference between aim and hypothesis. We also need to be able to explain the difference between a directional and a non-directional hypothesis. We will also look at variables, so independent and dependent variable, and we will talk about operationalizing those variables. Okay, so we're going to look at defining aims and hypothesis, explaining how to formulate a hypothesis, and to try and identify independent and dependent variables, which I'm sure a lot of you are very well versed in. Your task for next lesson is exposed here already, but I'll show it again at the end. And I've tried to put the documents on the chat, so hopefully you can access them. But if not, you can take a screenshot of this. But basically, we're working to be able to complete these tasks for the next session. So first things first, what is an aim? Okay, so an aim is a statement of the study's purpose. Okay, that is the aim in psychology. So it's a statement of what the researcher intends to find out. So it's quite important that we need to be quite specific about this, because in psychology there is a lot of key terminology that we need to be comfortable with, okay? So it's a statement of what the researcher intends to find out. So whenever we carry out a piece of research, it's essential that we have that aim in mind, okay? We need to know the purpose of what we're doing for it to be worthwhile. So for example, an aim is broader and less precise than a hypothesis, okay? Because we're obviously going to contrast an aim to a hypothesis in a second. So an aim is simply a statement of the purpose of the study. So for example, a suitable aim for memory might be to see if age affects the duration of short-term memory. That is purely just the aim of my study, okay? However, a hypothesis, on the other hand, a hypothesis or hypotheses are theories tested by research, okay? So this time, we're not just looking at the purpose of the research. This time, when we write a hypothesis, we need a clear, precise, testable, and predictive statement, okay? That's what a hypothesis is, okay? So it's either going to have to predict a difference or a correlation, depending on what kind of research we're doing. But it needs to be clear, it needs to be precise, and it needs to refer to our variables, okay? So it can either state a predicted difference between the independent and the dependent variable, or it can look at a relationship between variables. So if we're doing correlational analysis, we will be having some co-variables. So your hypothesis must refer to your independent and your dependent variable if we are looking at a difference, or it must refer to the co-variables if we're looking at a relationship, okay? So hopefully you remember what an independent and dependent variable is, but if you don't, my next slide goes through it. Oh, there it is, look, highlighted for you, important part. So an independent variable is the variable that let me just admit someone, is an independent variable that the experimenter manipulates or changes, okay? So the independent variable is the one that we assume is going to have an effect on the dependent variable. So I've got an example for you. So if we allocate participants to drug or placebo condition, that would be the independent variable, because that's the difference we're making. And then we're measuring how it affects their anxiety. That's then the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the variable that is being tested and measured, okay? And basically it depends on the independent variable. So an example of a dependent variable is depression symptoms, which depend on the independent variable, for example, the type of therapy. Okay, so hopefully that's freshened up in your minds what IV and DV is, independent variable, dependent variable. So the independent variable is the one that we change to see how it affects the dependent variable, and thus the dependent variable is the one we measure. Okay, so the next key thing in psychology is to make sure that we can operationalize those variables. Okay, so we must ensure that our hypothesis is written in a way that tells us literally how we're measuring the IV and the DV, you know, literally really pedantically what we are doing. So for example, you would have to say participants who chew mint flavored chewing gum during a task, requiring them to learn a random word sequence, will have a better recall of the word sequence compared to those who did it without chewing gum, okay? So it's really quite a detailed process. And that's what operationalizing means, to literally say it in a way that we know exactly how to test it. Okay, so you now know what an aim is in psychology, a statement of what the researcher intends to find. You know what a hypothesis is. It's a clear, precise, and testable statement. And you know that it needs to refer to your independent and your dependent variable if it's an experiment, or it needs to refer to the co-variables if it's a relationship. And you know you must write it in a way that is operationalized. You need to be really explicit about what those variables are. The last thing you need to know is the difference between directional and non-directional. So a directional hypothesis states the direction of the difference. So for example, here you could say that teenagers will sleep for more hours in a week than adults. Okay, so you're literally saying which group is going to perform better or worse. Whereas a non-directional hypothesis is one that says there's a difference, because obviously our hypothesis is going to suggest a difference, but it doesn't tell you in which direction. So for example, you're just going to say there will be a difference between teenagers and adults in the number of hours, but you haven't said which ones are going to sleep more or less. So for the purpose of statistical testing, we call a directional hypothesis. We refer to it as being one-tailed, and we refer to a non-directional hypothesis as being two-tailed. Okay, so one-tailed means that we're giving the direction of the difference, who will do better, who will do worse. Whereas a two-tailed hypothesis was still predicting a difference, but we're not saying in which way. Okay, so hopefully in your minds you're starting to think about, well, why do we need these two kinds of hypotheses? Okay, well, the reason is because of previous research. Okay, so if you are doing a piece of research that is based on previous work, you will have an idea as to which way you think your results will go. So you may use a directional hypothesis if you are repeating research, okay, or if there was previous research in that field. Whereas if your research is brand new and nothing like it has ever been done before, then you must have a non-directional, because obviously you're going to assume a difference. That is the purpose of your research, but you cannot assume which way it's going to go. Okay, so you now know the difference between one-tailed and two-tailed hypotheses, and you know when to use which one. Okay, so in theory, with everything I've gone through just now, you should be able to access your work that I would like you to have a go at completing for our next transition lesson. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for a minute, and I'm going to stop the recording so that you can ask some questions, which hopefully you'll be more comfortable to do once I stop the recording. So here we go.